There is a moment right before everything falls apart where your mind makes a decision it never tells you about. It happens in less than a second. No fanfare, no warning, no dramatic music. And whatever it decides in that fraction of a second quietly becomes the operating system you run on for months, sometimes years afterward. You didn't choose it consciously. Almost nobody ever does. It gets chosen for you by fear, by exhaustion, by whatever inherited script happened to be loudest that day. But right now, in whatever season you're actually in, that decision from the past is either protecting you or it's slowly working against you. And by the end of tonight, you're going to know exactly which one it is and exactly how to change it if it isn't serving you anymore. Maybe right now you're lying awake doing math you don't want to do, bills, timelines, apologies you owe or are owed, a diagnosis, a breakup, a job that vanished overnight, a dream that quietly died somewhere between your 20s and now without ever getting a proper funeral. Maybe you're the person everyone thinks is fine because you still show up, you still smile in the group chat, you still say, "I'm managing," when someone asks, while privately you feel like you're being slowly erased from the inside out. Perhaps right now you wake up already tired, and it isn't your body that's exhausted. It's something underneath your body, a weariness that 8 hours of sleep doesn't touch, because the thing that's tired was never your muscles in the first place. Maybe you've started to wonder quietly, in the moments right before sleep, if this is just who you are now, the tired version, the version that used to have plans and now just has coping strategies. Perhaps you've caught yourself scrolling through old photos of a version of you that seemed lighter, easier in their own skin, and you don't recognize the distance between then and now. Maybe you've stopped telling people how bad it actually is, not because you're hiding something shameful, but because you're tired of watching their faces try to figure out what to say. You are not lazy. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are not the only one who feels this specific combination of tired and behind and quietly ashamed of being tired and behind. You are, more likely than not, simply carrying more than any human mind was ever designed to carry without a structure underneath it to hold the weight. And nobody ever sat you down and gave you that structure. Nobody ever said, "Here is exactly what to do with your mind when your life falls apart." So you improvised, you made it up as you went, the way everyone does. And improvising under sustained pressure for months or years at a time will wear down even the strongest person alive, no matter how capable they've always seemed on the outside, no matter how many times someone has told them they handle things well. Handling things well and being quietly exhausted underneath it are not opposites. They live in the same body, most nights, at the exact same time. Maybe you've noticed the small ways the season leaks into everything else, even the parts of your life that used to feel untouched by it. The way you snap a little quicker at people who don't deserve it. The way you've quietly stopped making plans more than a few days out because some part of you has started assuming things won't hold long enough to matter. The way certain songs, certain smells, certain ordinary Tuesday afternoons suddenly carry weight they never used to carry, simply because they remind you of who you were before this season started. None of that means you're falling apart. It means you're human, carrying something human-sized pain in a body that was never given an instruction manual for it. Here's what almost nobody tells you about hard seasons, and it's the thing this entire video is built around. They don't just test your circumstances, they test your mind's operating instructions. And most people, without realizing it, are running instructions they inherited by accident, fear-based, scarcity-based, borrowed from a tired parent, a cynical friend, or a culture that quietly worships struggle without ever teaching anyone how to master it. Napoleon Hill spent over 20 years studying the most successful people of his era, men who had endured collapse, betrayal, public humiliation, and total financial ruin. And he found something almost every single one of them shared underneath the surface. It wasn't luck. It wasn't privilege. It wasn't even talent, at least not primarily. It was that somewhere in the exact middle of their hardest season, while everything was still on fire, they made a deliberate, conscious decision about what their mind was allowed to believe going forward. That decision is what we're going to build together right now, piece by piece, principle by principle, until you're holding something sturdier than a burst of temporary motivation. You're going to walk away from this with a structure, and a structure holds you up even on the specific days when motivation simply doesn't show up for work. The first thing every one of Hill's subjects had in common was what he called definiteness of purpose. Not a vague wish, not, I hope things get better soon. A sharp, specific, almost stubborn clarity about what they were building toward, even while the world around them was actively collapsing. Here is the myth most people believe without ever questioning it, that purpose is something you find once things calm down, once the crisis has fully passed, once you finally have the spare energy for it. Hill found the exact opposite to be true again and again across dozens of case studies. The people who came out of devastating seasons stronger, not just intact, but genuinely stronger, were the ones who sharpened their purpose during the storm itself, not politely after it. Andrew Carnegie, long before he became one of the wealthiest men in American history, worked as a telegraph operator for barely enough money to survive on in a new country that offered a young immigrant no guarantees and no safety net whatsoever. What separated him from the thousands of other boys doing nearly identical work for nearly identical wages wasn't raw talent alone. It was that he had already decided, with startling specificity for someone so young, exactly what kind of life he intended to build for himself, and he treated every difficult season along the way as a temporary condition to be moved through, never as a permanent identity to be absorbed and worn forever. Your pain right now is real. Nobody watching this is going to tell you otherwise. But your pain is not your purpose. And the moment you quietly confuse the two, you start organizing your entire life around the wound instead of around the work you were actually meant to do while you're here. So here is your action step, plain and doable tonight. No equipment required. Take 5 minutes, no more than 5, and write one single sentence that begins with the words, I am becoming someone who, not someone who merely survived this season. Someone who is actively becoming something in spite of it because of the muscle it forced you to build. Read that sentence before you sleep tonight. That single sentence is the first brick in your new structure, and every structure, no matter how tall it eventually becomes, starts with one brick laid by hand. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The people around you who seem to move through hard seasons with some kind of quiet steadiness aren't necessarily experiencing less pain than you are. In most cases, they're simply experiencing it with a sentence like this one already sitting underneath them, holding their weight while the rest of them wobbles. You can build that same floor tonight. It doesn't require permission from anyone, and it doesn't require the season to end first. It only requires you to stop waiting for solid ground to appear on its own and start laying it yourself, sentence by sentence, one honest brick at a time. The second principle is faith, and I want to be careful here, because faith gets treated in most self-help content like a soft, passive word, something you either happen to have or you don't, almost like eye color fixed at birth. Hill didn't mean it that way at all, and understanding the difference changes everything. He meant faith as an active, almost aggressive discipline, the deliberate, repeated practice of believing in a specific outcome before any concrete evidence exists yet to support it. This is genuinely uncomfortable to hear because your current pain is loud, constant, and immediate, and your future outcome is silent, distant, and unproven. Silence is easy to doubt. Evidence you don't yet possess is easy to dismiss as wishful thinking, but every person who has ever built something meaningful out of a genuinely hard season had to believe in it before it was fully reasonable to. Henry Ford was told, bluntly and repeatedly, by nearly every trained engineer he consulted, that a lightweight, affordable engine capable of true mass production was essentially impossible given the technology available at the time. He was mocked for it in print by people whose job titles suggested they understood the subject better than he did. He kept building anyway, not because he possessed secret proof he was right, but because he had made a firm decision, as a discipline rather than a feeling, to act as though he was right until the evidence eventually caught up to meet him. That is faith in Hill's specific sense of the word. It's not denial of your actual circumstances. It's a refusal to let your circumstances write the final chapter of your story before you've had a fair chance to write it yourself, in your own handwriting. Here's the myth-busting part because I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, that this sounds suspiciously like toxic positivity, like pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. It's actually the opposite of that. Faith, done properly and honestly, doesn't ask you to ignore or minimize the pain you're in. It asks you to hold the pain in one hand and hold a stubborn, evidence-optional belief in your own future in the other hand at the exact same time, without letting either one quietly cancel the other out. Your action step tonight is small but deliberately specific. Speak one sentence out loud, alone, in a room with the door closed if you need privacy, about where you'll be in 12 months from now. Not phrased as a hope, phrased as a stated fact you simply haven't arrived at yet. Your own voice needs to physically hear you say it. Your voice, strangely enough, believes things your silent internal thoughts never quite manage to. There is something almost physical about hearing your own voice commit to something out loud, alone in a room, with nobody there to perform for. It bypasses the part of you that negotiates and doubts in silence, and it speaks directly to the part of you that remembers, even now, what it once felt like to expect good things instead of merely hoping for them. The third principle, and this is the one most people skip past far too quickly because it sounds almost too simple to matter, is autosuggestion. The repeated, deliberate feeding of specific chosen thoughts into your own subconscious mind until they take root and begin operating automatically without requiring your conscious effort anymore. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you in a useful way. Your mind is already doing this to you right now, every single day, whether or not you're consciously directing it. Every single time you think, I always mess this up, or nothing ever works out for me, you are running auto-suggestion, just pointed in exactly the wrong direction, and your subconscious mind does not distinguish between the thoughts you chose on purpose and the thoughts you simply repeated out of exhausted habit. It absorbs both categories equally, without judgment, like soil absorbs whatever seed happens to land on it. This is the invisible program I mentioned right at the start of tonight, running quietly in the background of your mind, shaping your decisions, your posture, the tone of your voice, your willingness to even try something new, long before you're consciously aware it's influencing you at all. John D. Rockefeller, during seasons of genuinely intense financial pressure early in his career, was known to keep a private ledger that recorded not just numbers and figures, but principles, specific phrases he returned to and repeated to himself with almost religious discipline, deliberately reinforcing a chosen identity rather than the anxious, fearful one his circumstances might have handed him for free if he'd simply let them. He understood decades before this became fashionable language in any bookstore that whoever controls the repeated inner sentence eventually controls the outer result it produces. This is worth sitting with because it means the voice narrating your day right now, the one commenting quietly on every small setback and every small win, is not neutral. It is either working for you or working against you, and it rarely stays neutral for long once you start paying attention to it. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. And conceiving isn't a single flash of inspiration that strikes you once and disappears. It's a repeated act, done daily, sometimes hourly during the hardest stretches, until belief slowly calcifies into something closer to identity itself. Your action step here is simple and it costs you nothing but 60 seconds, twice a day, morning and night. Choose one sentence, not a paragraph, just one clean sentence that describes who you are actively becoming, and say it to yourself deliberately, out loud if you can manage it, for the next 7 consecutive days. You are not lying to yourself in doing this. You are overwriting an old file with a new one on purpose for what might be the first time in your life, instead of leaving it to happen by accident the way it always has before now. The fourth principle is organized planning, and this is exactly where a lot of well-meaning motivational content quietly fails people because it stops comfortably at belief and never gives you the scaffolding that belief actually needs in order to survive real contact with a hard season. Believing without a plan is a little like building a fire with no wood underneath it. You'll get a spark, maybe even a brief flame that feels promising, but it will not last through the night, and you'll be right back in the dark by morning. Thomas Edison, Across the many thousands of failed experiments that eventually produced a working incandescent light bulb, was not simply persistent in a vague, purely emotional sense of the word. He was ferociously organized, almost obsessively so. Every single failed attempt was logged, categorized, and examined closely for what it had eliminated and what it had quietly revealed about the next attempt. He treated failure consistently as data to be studied, never as a final verdict on his ability or his worth. That distinction is small on paper and enormous in practice. A verdict ends the story. Data simply tells you what to adjust before the next attempt, and it leaves the ending completely open, which is exactly why it protects the mind so much more effectively during a long, grinding season. Most people believe organized planning is something reserved for people who already have their entire life together, that you plan responsibly once the chaos has fully settled down. Hill's research suggested almost the exact reverse of this common assumption. The hardest seasons of your life are precisely when a plan matters the most, because a plan is often the only thing capable of keeping you moving in a single, consistent direction when your emotions are actively pulling you in 5 or 6 different directions at once, all day, every day. Here's your action step, and I genuinely want you to do this one tonight, not simply nod along and move on. Take one single piece of paper and write down the very next physical action. Not the entire solution, not the whole staircase, just the next single visible step that moves you one honest inch toward the becoming sentence you wrote down earlier. One step, not the plan for the whole mountain, just the step directly in front of your foot right now, tonight. Most people overestimate what a plan needs to look like, and that overestimation is exactly what keeps them frozen. A plan does not need 12 stages and a color-coded spreadsheet to be real. A plan can be a single index card with a single line written on it, as long as that line gets acted on before you sleep. Complexity feels productive in the moment, but simplicity is what actually survives contact with a genuinely hard season, because a hard season doesn't leave you the spare mental bandwidth to manage anything elaborate. The fifth principle, and perhaps the one that ultimately determines whether all the others hold their shape under pressure, is persistence. Hill was remarkably blunt about this particular principle in a way that still stings a little every time I revisit it. He observed across case after case that the majority of people who fail at something meaningful do so not because they lack the necessary ability, but because they quit at the exact moment right before their turning point, and they simply never find out afterward how close they actually were to it. Think about that for a genuine second and let it land. Somewhere out there, in some parallel version of this exact season, is a version of you who kept going for 3 more weeks and quietly watched everything begin to change, and another version of you who stopped right here, right now, and never got the chance to find out what was waiting just past this point. The line separating those two people is not talent. It is not luck, and it is certainly not some mysterious advantage one of them was simply born with. It is, in almost every documented case Hill studied, simply whether they kept their foot moving forward when it would have been so much easier, so much more socially acceptable to quietly sit down and call it a reasonable stopping point. Andrew Carnegie again, and this is genuinely worth repeating because repetition is how belief gets built, not an accident of lazy writing, endured repeated business setbacks that would have permanently ended most people's ambition outright, and yet he consistently treated each one as a temporary detour rather than a final verdict on his worth or his future prospects. That's the callback phrase I want humming quietly underneath everything else tonight, the one I want you to actually remember tomorrow morning. A hard season is a detour, not a destination. Say that to yourself the next time it starts to feel permanent, because it will start to feel permanent, probably sooner than you'd like. Likely on some ordinary afternoon when nothing dramatic has even happened, when the weight just quietly settles in and starts whispering that this is simply how things are now. That whisper is lying to you. It has always been lying to every person who ever went on to build something worth building. A hard season is a detour, not a destination. Your action step for persistence tonight is the simplest one of all, and also, honestly, the hardest to actually follow through on. Decide right now, on one specific thing you were quietly considering giving up on, that you will give it 72 more hours before making any final, irreversible decision about it. Not forever. Not another year of your life, not even another full week, just 72 hours, long enough potentially to find out you were closer than you ever realized. Notice that this isn't a demand for blind optimism. It's a demand for one more honest attempt before the door closes for good, because doors that close from quitting rarely reopen the way doors that close from genuine exhausted completion sometimes do. There's a difference between finishing something and abandoning it mid-sentence, and only you know deep down which one you're actually about to do. The sixth and final principle I want to leave with you tonight is what Hill called the master mind, the idea that no mind, however sharp or disciplined, was ever built to carry a hard season entirely alone. Most people hear self-improvement and quietly assume it means isolating themselves, gritting their teeth, and pushing through in total silence, as if needing support were some kind of quiet failure. Hill found precisely the opposite in every case he examined closely. Every single figure he studied, without exception, surrounded themselves deliberately with at least one other mind they trusted completely, someone whose thinking sharpened their own, rather than simply echoing it back to them. Henry Ford relied heavily on a small, carefully chosen circle of advisors and engineers whose combined thinking, blended honestly with his own, produced ideas that neither party could have reached alone in isolation. This is the myth-busting moment for this final principle, and it might be the most important one tonight. Most people believe that asking for support during a hard season is a sign of personal weakness, something to hide from others out of pride. Hill's research suggested the reverse is almost always true. The people who recovered fastest and rebuilt strongest were, virtually without exception, the ones humble enough to let at least one other trusted mind into the room with them while they were still actively rebuilding, rather than waiting politely until everything was already fixed to let anyone see the mess. Your action step here is simple and slightly uncomfortable on purpose. Reach out tonight or first thing tomorrow morning to exactly one person you trust and tell them one honest sentence about where you actually are right now, not the polished version you usually give. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be a full confession. It simply needs to be true, and it simply needs to leave your own head and enter someone else's, because a thought that only ever lives inside one mind has a way of growing heavier the longer it stays there unspoken. I want to pause here and name something directly because I think it matters more than any single principle on its own. These 6 ideas are not meant to be collected like trophies and forgotten by morning. They are meant to work together quietly, like the different legs of the same table. Purpose without faith becomes a plan you secretly don't believe in. Faith without a plan becomes a feeling that evaporates the first time reality pushes back. Autosuggestion without persistence becomes a nice morning ritual that dies out by the second week. And persistence without a trusted mind beside you becomes the loneliest kind of stubbornness, the kind that burns you out quietly instead of carrying you through. You do not need to be perfect at all 6 tonight. You need to start moving on all 6, even imperfectly, even clumsily, the way anyone starts anything worth eventually mastering. Now I want to step out of teaching for just a moment, because I'd genuinely be lying to you if I pretended I was only relaying Hill's philosophy from some safe, comfortable distance, untouched by any of it myself. I know what it is to lie awake doing the exact kind of math I described earlier tonight. I know what it feels like to smile convincingly in a group chat while quietly wondering if you've become someone you no longer recognize in the mirror. I know the very specific kind of loneliness that comes from carrying something heavy while everyone around you assumes you're fine, simply because you've gotten disturbingly good over time at performing fine on command. And I want to tell you something that took me far, far too long to learn myself, and that I have no interest in dressing up tonight with false, easy positivity. Protecting your mind during the hardest season of your life was never about pretending the season isn't genuinely hard. It's about refusing, deliberately and repeatedly, to let the season write the permanent story of who you are. The season is real. Your pain inside it is real. And nobody watching this is asking you to minimize that. But it is a chapter, not the entire book. And you are still somehow, against all odds, the author of it. Even on the specific nights, it doesn't feel that way at all. A hard season is a detour, not a destination. You've heard that once already tonight. You're going to hear it once more before we're finished, because your mind needs repetition the way a muscle needs reps under load, not because you're forgetful, but because that is simply, mechanically, how belief actually gets built over time. I wish someone had told me that earlier in my own life, back when I assumed strength meant never needing to hear something twice. It doesn't. Strength, it turns out, often just means being willing to hear the same true thing again and again, patiently, until it finally outweighs the old false thing it's replacing. Here's what I need you to understand clearly about the next 24 hours, because everything said tonight becomes nothing more than pleasant background noise the moment you close this video and change absolutely nothing about tomorrow. In the next 24 hours, before you let yourself scroll mindlessly, before you let the old default thoughts quietly take the wheel again like they always have, I want you to do 4 things tonight, and only 4, because simplicity survives hard seasons far better than complexity ever does. Say your becoming sentence out loud, twice, once now, and once before you sleep. Write down the one physical next step and actually do it, even if it feels small, even if it feels almost embarrassingly minor compared to the size of what you're facing. Give the thing you were quietly about to quit its 72 hours. No more, no less. And reach out to that one trusted person with one honest sentence about where you really are. That's the entire assignment tonight, not a full life overhaul. Just 4 small, deliberate acts of taking your own mind back from autopilot and putting your hands finally back on the controls yourself. Nobody is coming to do this for you, and I say that with as much warmth as I can put into it, not as a criticism. Nobody could do it for you, even if they wanted to, because the mind you're rebuilding is the one thing in this entire situation that only you have access to. That's not a burden. It's the one piece of this that was always fully, completely yours to direct. A hard season is a detour, not a destination. And detours, by their very definition, eventually lead back to a road. You are not who this season currently says you are. You are who you keep quietly deciding to become. One repeated sentence, one organized step, one trusted conversation, one extra 72 hours at a time, and whatever your mind can genuinely conceive and steadily, repeatedly believe it can eventually, against all reasonable odds, achieve. Before you go tonight, I want exactly one word from you in the comments below. Just one single word. The thing you're personally committing to protect in your own mind starting right now. Because saying it quietly to yourself is powerful, but saying it somewhere you can't quietly take it back later is even more powerful still. Whatever that word turns out to be tonight, let it be the first honest sentence in a story you're finally writing on purpose, instead of the one this season tried to write for you without ever asking permission.